I'm Michelle Glauser. I do community development for Twilio. So welcome everyone to Signal. We are so excited to have Ricky Holtz speak today. So please give him a warm welcome.
All right. Is everybody? You know what? I can hear myself. I'm taking these off. Okay. So one quick comment. I've always wanted to go to a silent disco. And I never realized that this was going to be my first experience at one, but it's great. I'm excited. So I'd like to start with the question: who here identifies primarily as a backend developer or just prefers doing backend development? Yeah. Okay. Great. So if you take a look around, keep the hands up. Take a look around. I think that's a majority of the room, and I think that makes a lot of sense. We're all here at Signal, and I think that Twilio is a platform that's built by backend developers for backend developers. And so we're here today talking about JavaScript, the front-end framework, or the front-end language, because we just announced, laptop turned off. Anyway, because we just announced Flex. And while we offer some SDK products, I think that Flex is probably the first opinionated front end that Twilio has really created. And so, long passcode. So I think as backend developers, that's maybe a little bit intimidating because now you have to use JavaScript. Maybe it's a little bit annoying because now you have to use JavaScript. It's just not the natural language to necessarily be using, but it is a requirement for building your front-end applications. And moving forward with Flex, it's going to be you pretty much have to build that UI using JavaScript. And so JavaScript has a lot of baggage. You can do a quick Google search, and there's a bunch of stuff. So I found a 40-minute talk where somebody's just talking about how bad JavaScript is at a front-end development conference. There's also, let me open these in new tabs. A lot of us are familiar with this book, JavaScript, The Good Parts, with the implication here being that there are lots of bad parts to JavaScript. So, I mean, literally one of the canonical texts implicitly just talks about how bad JavaScript is. And then I highly recommend watching this talk. It's called WAT. And this guy basically does a lightning talk about, he kind of pokes fun at Ruby and some of the quirks of Ruby, but it's really just 5 minutes of him being look, JavaScript doesn't know how to handle data. So, oh, and one more thing that I just thought of, jQuery. There's literally an entire framework just trying to make this language feasible to write in. So I get it. JavaScript is kind of rough. But well, I'm Ricky Holtz. I'm a sales engineer here at Twilio. I work on the commercial team, so basically supporting salespeople, supporting developers like you who are trying to build with Twilio. And before I came to Twilio as a sales engineer, I was a front-end developer. So I really like JavaScript, and I was a little bit intimidating coming to Twilio, and I'm super excited to be here and to try to convert you to the school of thought that JavaScript isn't that terrible. Specifically because in 2015, the ECMAScript consortium or something like that started creating a bunch of specifications for the language saying, all right, this is going to be a turning point for us. JavaScript has some warts, and we're going to try to fix those. And so with ECMAScript 2015, I just call it ES6. They're kind of interchangeable. I think that it's brought a lot of features to JavaScript that make the language a lot easier to write, a lot more maintainable, and ultimately, I think that it makes coding with JavaScript a little less of a frustration and a lot more fun. So I thought about the strategy where we would just kind of go through a bunch of slides showing you some of these new features, but instead, I think we're just going to jump in and refactor a code base. So we're going to look at something that's written in old JavaScript, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the features of new JavaScript and start implementing them as we go along. So basically, I wrote an application that pulls some message logs from Twilio, and then it just renders them on the screen. It's super basic JavaScript. I know that you've probably heard talks about React, or you've just heard about React in relation to Flex. We're not going to touch on React right now, but just suffice to say that learning to write in this modern JavaScript, well, one, that's just learning JavaScript. So I say, if you're learning JavaScript, or if you are returning to JavaScript, don't worry about like relearning JavaScript and learning ES6. Just focus on ES6. Learn the new syntax. This is what JavaScript is going to look like moving forward. Browsers are supporting this, like more and more of these features as time goes on. So front-end development, we're always thinking about backwards compatibility. There are ways to work around that. Basically, learn to write your JavaScript using ES6. It's going to make writing React a lot easier. It's going to make those code examples make a lot more sense. And really, it's just going to make your life as a developer a lot easier as well. So yeah, we have this message log application built using standard JavaScript. And yeah, this is what it looks like. It's basically messages from my account. So you can see that it's me like texting stop and start to phone numbers. I was testing with a friend, so you'll see that somebody is telling me to shut up because I'm spamming them. They're right there. Hey, Rima. And so, yeah, let's just sort of dive into this. So this is my index.js file. I've got a to-do list up here that we'll return to in a moment. But just going through this, let's just sort of walk through the code. Right here, well, first, can you just like show me, like, can everybody sort of read this? Has an idea what's going on? Thumbs up. Cheers, thank y'all. All right, and if you do, I'm gonna try to like look up. So if you need the screen size increase, just like raise your hand or something, and I'm just gonna take that as a sign to magnify. Okay, so a couple of things I'm doing here. First, I'm just getting something in my DOM. I'm going to use that later to like populate all the message logs in there. I have this class. So this is class declaration in old JavaScript. Everything that we're looking at right now is going to be classical JavaScript. So I've created a class called my message list class. And on that, I created a method to append messages to it. I also have a method for creating an actual like paragraph node in the DOM. And then I have a method for appending a method. These are poorly named. Two hard things in computer science: naming and cache invalidation and off by one errors. So I have a method to append messages to the entire DOM, and then I have a method to append one message to my message list. Anyway. And then right here, this is a weird thing that I imagine probably not a lot of people are familiar with. It's an XML HTTP request. So this was the way to do async in JavaScript to like make a network request. I think a lot of people look at the documentation for this thing and say, I'm going to use jQuery's Ajax. I agree. It's a terrible API. Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second. So hopefully, like, some of the intent of this code is coming through. Essentially, I get all of my messages down here. So I'm just pulling this from a Twilio function. And then once I actually get a response, this is listening for the request. It's going to create a current messages variable. It's going to instantiate a new message list. And then the message list is going to start appending messages to the DOM. And it's basically just doing that by creating DOM nodes. So we're creating divs, we're creating paragraphs, and then just sort of slapping them onto the DOM. So what can we start doing to make this code base a little bit more readable, a little bit more, I don't know, modern? I think the first to-do that I would see here is to use more semantic variable declarations. So in the old version of JavaScript, we're using var, right? That's what a variable is. Var, variable, var, however you want to say it. But in ES6, we have two new ways to declare variables. So there's still var, but we're not going to use it. For our purposes, var is a bad word. It's very confusing. Essentially, with var, you have function scope and you have like global scope. So if you use a var inside of a function, then you only have access to it in that function. Otherwise, it's a globally accessible variable. Some of you might be imagining this could be very confusing when you're doing something like a for loop. It's just going to mean that like when you declare var I outside of a specific function, that's going to modify every other I in the program. So if you had like two for loops running at the same time, they could start interfering with like what I is. It can get really confusing. So now we have two new keywords in ES6 that are always block scoped. And those keywords are const and let. So some of the intent kind of comes through in here with like const. That makes a variable constant. That just means like this thing can't be reassigned. And then we're going to let this thing be some value, and later on we will go back and we can modify the value of that variable. Again, both of these are now block scoped, so we have a little bit more predictable behavior of our variables when we're using const and let. And also, I think when you're starting to read the code, you start to understand the developer's intent. Right? Now you know, okay, we created something that is going to consistently be this. Or when we see let, what we're saying is this variable is going to be changing. You need to be wary of this variable. It is stateful. Quick note about const that I think is important, but we won't drill too deeply into. Const means that like things are constant but not immutable. So if you have an object, for example, you can create an object, but you can modify the keys in the object. And I have some documentation stuff we'll talk about at the end. So you can go check this out and get more detail about this later on. But for now, I'm going to just go ahead, take all of my vars, and I like to start with const. I want to know what my data is. I want it to be consistent. So I would say when you are writing your code, start with const, and yeah, let's just replace all this. So, sorry, constable declarations. Okay, let's undo that. All right, so let's find our vars and replace with const. All right, then we're going to save this, and we're going to hop back over to our message logs, and we have an error. So when we go into the console, there it is. So uncaught type error, assignment to constant variable. So there's a problem here. You might have noticed it. I wrote a for loop, and so this is a good example of where in my for loop, I said const I equals 0, and then the for loop is going to try to reassign that, right? It's going to iterate over, like after we append the first message, it's going to try to change that 0 to a 1, and it's not allowed to do that because that variable is constant. So for our purposes, we're going to let I equal 0 for now, and it can go ahead and change later. And then when we go back to our message logs, this is running. So that's a pretty easy win. If you're like wondering what to do, change your variables, right? Const, let, pretty easy. Now, this one is going to be a little trickier. I think that this class declaration is really confusing. We have just a function that looks like every other function, and then this is actually a constructor function. So this is telling us what our class like what information we need for to construct our class. And then we have all these methods, but the methods are sort of broken out. None of this is really encapsulated inside of a single class declaration. And so classes are, I don't know, controversial in the JavaScript community. Everything's controversial in like every development community. So I don't know, go read a thread about it. But there is a way to do this to like use, there's a new class declaration in JavaScript that we're gonna test out now. And one quick thing that I'll say is I typically don't use a lot of classes in my JavaScript development. But it is useful when you're writing React. There are class-based components and functional components. So I'm going to power through this and have a lot of syntax errors because it's important to know, it's good to know, and I don't know, let's give it a try. So class message list, and now we have a class, and then we can write a constructor function. And the constructor is still going to take a list and a target node. And then we can go ahead and say this dot list equals list. And this dot target node equals target node. And that pretty much replaces this constructor function. So we'll get rid of that. And now here, when we get to these methods, this is where we can start taking the append messages method that we have here. Let's pull that into the class. So we have a class declaration, we have a very clearly defined constructor, and then here, instead of doing all this like message list.prototype dot append messages, sort of like modifying the method on this object, it's confusing. All we have to do is just say append messages, and And actually, we can also get rid of the function notation here. So it's just append messages, and here's a method on our class. And then we can basically keep doing this down here with all these message list prototype methods. Create paragraph and okay. I don't know. Let's try it. See if maybe someone sees a syntax error. I think there's bound to be one, but we're gonna work through this together. Hey, we did it. Okay, so there we go. Same. We've basically just replaced this class, and so again, classes might be controversial in JavaScript. Maybe you have some of your own opinions about them as well. I do think that ultimately this class. This like syntax for classes is a lot cleaner, a lot more understandable, and just right out the gate, we start to have keywords that indicate what this code is trying to do. We have a clear constructor function. We have methods on them that look a lot more familiar, and everything is still encapsulated in this single block of code. So I'm going to call that a win, and to done. Now, I also want to use a more consistent function notation here. So a lot of the functions are just like methods now, but one of the cool things about ES6 is arrow notation. So in JavaScript, there are a couple of ways to define your functions. So we could say function request listener and just name the function here. We can also have anonymous functions. So ostensibly like this would work, but we just can't reference it anywhere. But then we could say like const blank equals function, and that's going to be another way to write our function and assign it. I personally just always kind of write arrow functions at this point, and what that does is it takes that function keyword from here, and instead of writing function, we just throw in an arrow here. And so that like equal sign, greater than, less than, whatever, that is like that's creating an arrow for you, and it brings in a little bit of functionality, specifically around the this keyword. So I haven't really exemplified this well here, but you can run into issues where this refers to something different depending on like where you are in the code, and so using that arrow function will immediately bind the context that the function is run in to this. So it really helps with like, you don't have to use as many like bind methods and stuff like that. Again, I think that's stuff to like go into a little bit more detail on in a like, I don't know, on your own time when we're not like racing through a refactor. So bind functionality comes in there, but there's also some nice stuff that you can do with arrow functions where, well, I'll talk about them in a second. No, I won't. I refactored my code base, so one of my examples is gone. I'm just going to show you right now. So let's say like const multiply equals number, return number, called square. Okay, makes sense. Like standard multiply function or squaring function, we pass in a number and then we can return the number times the number. With arrow functions, we only have one parameter for the function here, so we can actually remove that and we can just say like, okay, const square equals number, and then the number should return number times number. And then we can actually remove even more from this, where we don't need the block anymore. We can just say const square equals number, the number returns number times number. So you can just start removing a lot of this like extra like, I don't know, boilerplate from your code. So there's just some nice features of using these arrow functions, especially when you're writing like mapping functions, passing in anonymous functions. You can start to just pass in a little bit less. You're writing a little bit less. It makes the actual like vertical space of the code a little bit shorter. So just something to know about with arrow functions. For now, Again, I always write using arrow functions, so I'm going to change the one function that I have right now to an arrow function, and I'm going to call that done. And so now I'm going to return to some of my methods here, and I'm going to add default parameters to functions. So this is this is one of those things where it's like, it took a long time for this to be available. When I was writing Python, I remember being able to use default parameters, and I was like, oh, sweet, like that captures so many edge cases. JavaScript, it's like, good luck. Hopefully people are using these functions correctly, or I don't know, you're getting the right data. So what we can do what we're able to do in ES6 is actually declare smarter defaults. So let me see here. Yeah, so like here in my create paragraph, one of the things that I'm asking for is text. It's HTML. I obviously need some text, and then I'm asking for a class so that I know which class to add to that DOM. And so for the class, I could just say new class equals body, and now that's going to be a default parameter. And so I just want anything to be body text, and then if it's not body text, I'll actually declare what it should be. So down here, when I'm appending an actual message or like my message.body, I can remove that. And now, because I just know that I have a smarter default for what all of my code should be. So default parameters are a nice little feature of ES6. So call that done. And now let's hop over here and just make sure everything's still running. Nope, it's not. That's why we do these tests. Okay, so yes. All right, so right here, the request listener actually isn't getting the response text. So I just need to fix this method really quickly because we're creating the new message list in this new class. We've got the bind in there already, so well, let me see if that fixes things.
And then the third one is Append competitive intelligence. So here is a real-world story. There is an insurer that found that their chatbot was getting all of a sudden a lot of questions about winter tires.
I'll return to this in a second because I actually want to get rid of this in a minute anyway. So yeah. Okay, so pushing forward, one of the things that I want to do here is also use object destructuring. So when you're coding in really, I guess, any programming language, but it's going to be very common when you're doing front-end development. You're getting these big data objects from some server somewhere, and then you want to turn those into DOM nodes. You want to react to that data somehow. So what we can do is destructure these objects and sort of get some variables ahead of time, declare our variables, and instead of always using dot notation to figure out what properties are on the object, we can just destructure them ahead of time. So here, this message that I'm getting in the append message function it's an object. It's an object that represents like an SMS that I've sent in the past. So what I can do is take that message object, and I can, well, when we look down to my code, I'm getting the date sent. I'm using the message sid, so message.sid, and I'm using message.body. So right here, I can do const date sent sid and body equals message, and it's going to create a constant variable for each one of those properties on the object. So it's going to take whatever's on the date sent key, assign that to a variable called date sent, and similarly for sid and body. And so then I can say date sent, I can say sid and body. And since message is pretty much the only thing being passed into this function, it's the only parameter, I'm actually able to take that destructuring assignment and pass it in as the argument to this function, and now my append message function will actually take the it's going to take whatever object is passed into it. It's going to pull out the date sent parameter, the date sent key, the SID key, and the body key, and then it's going to create variables for each one of those. So that's just a nice little workaround, and again, it kind of cleans up your code and gets rid of some of this dot notation. When you have nested objects, it gets you away from having to do like blank dot blank dot blank dot blank. So that can be pretty nice as well. Also note that this works on arrays. So another cool thing to check out, you can sort of target each one of the elements in an array. So destructuring is done. I'm going to skip over the template literals because I'm really mad at XML HTTP request right now, and I want to get rid of that so my code works again. And so right here, getting rid of the XML HTTP request. This is the way of handling async. It involves callbacks, a really complex API with a bunch of methods for opening, sending the request, handling the request with an event listener. It's kind of a mess of an API. And so one of the things that ES6 introduces, it's called a promise, which is essentially a promise for data. And so promises were used to build a new browser API called fetch. And so now, instead of doing all this XML HTTP request stuff or bringing in jQuery just to use Ajax or a couple of other features, there's a much cleaner API for doing asynchronous requests on the browser. And so what we're able to do, now is take all of this code from like 45 to 53. I can write fetch. By default, it's going to do a GET request. So no need to do this like actual request declaration. I just say, I want to fetch whatever's at this resource. And then, okay, now what? Like once that has been fetched, we say .then. So then I want to do something, and this is where we can start using arrow notation. I want to take that response and I want to parse it into a JSON. And then I actually want to do something with that data. And that's where we can use this request listener, the logic in here. So we can say, create a new message list. A new message list using data.messages, put that on the message container, and then start appending messages. So I'll go ahead, I'll comment it out for now. But let's see if we run over here. Sweet, it's working again. So now we're back to sort of our regular state. At this point, we've replaced the async. We've gotten rid of, or we've destructured some of these objects. We've added some default parameters, and everything is still going to be working for us. So call that done. All right. So one other thing that I find a little frustrating about this code is, one, I'm a single quote kind of guy, so I use like the apostrophe for doing strings. But you'll notice here I used double quotes for those strings. So I don't know, that's probably a lot of programming languages, but nonetheless, use a linter. Don't be this person who like mixes and matches double quotes and single quotes. But also, this is just like a really intense string that we're building here. So it's like message sent on message. Like obviously, I have to do some of this work to like extract features of the date. But then I'm like adding in these dashes, just trying to make this date object a little bit more readable. And what I think, just like zooming out from this, it's a really weird thing to look at. There are quotes everywhere. There are plus signs everywhere. Everybody has like run into that programming thing where you're like, I don't know, you like miss the space here, and then you have to like go back and redeploy, or not redeploy, but just like recompile something because you forgot a space. So one of the cool things that comes in ES6 is it's called a template literal. So what we can do is take this whole string. I'll just go ahead and copy it and drop it up here. And a template literal, Forget this. Okay. A template literal starts with a backtick. So we use the backtick and, well, my editor's adding the other backtick. And now we can start writing message sent on. And now, instead of like having to break this string apart and start like concatenating it using plus signs, we can use a $sign and put in curly braces. And then we can start coding inside of our string. So we're creating a template for the string and then saying like, okay, inside of this template, what needs to happen? Well, I need to take my message date. I need to get the month. And because the JavaScript date object's kind of weird, I need to add a 1 to it. I don't know. And then we just keep going. So I added the dash and then message date dot get date. And finally, message date dot get year, and great. And then the last thing is just to add that date class that that I have at the bottom, and I'll replace that. It's way less intense to look at, and again, just like looking at this, it has become an actual template for the string that we want to build instead of literally concatenating a string as we go. So we'll save that, run over here, run into another bug. Oh yeah, okay, that's fine. Oops. Did I call something date instead of message date? Huh? Oh, thank you. All right, and we're back. Okay, so sweet, template literal. All right, now one more thing that I want to do here. This is sort of a mega script that we're building. I think we've removed quite a bit of code from it, but we can sort of, with ES6, we're able to start modularizing our code. And I think a good candidate for this is the message list. It's sort of its own thing. It's an entirely separate object. It's not really the job of our index.js to manage a message list. Really, the job of the index.js is to, I don't know, populate the index.html. So what I'm able to do is create a module and import that into my the main index.js script, and then start using things from it. So right here, I have my script type equals module. So that's saying like, all right, this script itself is going to be using this module pattern. And then over here in index.js, or in my JS file, I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call it messages.js, or I'll call it messagelist.js. And then I'm going to take this class, bring it into message list. Oh, I just brought in a bunch of React code. Get rid of that. Okay, so bring the message list in, and then I'm going to export the message list. And so now this is starting to like prep ES6 to know that this thing is exportable. It doesn't need to just live in this file. And then when I come over to my index.js, I can say import message list from there we go. And so I'm basically taking this class that I've created called message list and importing it into my index.js. And I'm pretty sure that everything will run pretty smoothly from here. So yeah, still working. And there are other things that we can do here. like you can have a default declaration. So like we could say export default message list, and since there's only one default per file, I could just say like import message list from message list, and that'll still work. But then I could rename message list to like
They funded that through the savings by automating the simple interactions with the chatbot. The goal of the chatbot is not
do it this way. Main message list, main message list. That still works using the default declaration. So that just gives you the freedom to sort of like name this thing whatever you want. But for now, say that's done, and we modularize the logic. So that's a lot of ES6 features. There's still some, I think, some more stuff that we can do here. For example, again, I'm not huge on object-oriented programming. I don't really like for loops because I don't like that statefulness of the let in there. So I can replace this with for each loop. So I could say this.list.forEach. So this is probably pretty familiar syntax for quite a few people, but essentially for each is just going to take an array and start iterating over all the elements in the array and apply a function to them. So for each message, I want to this dot append message. So also a little bit cleaner, I would argue. You don't have all the like brackets from like having to like actually indicate where you are in the array. You obviously don't have all of the boilerplate that comes with writing a for loop. So you just say this.list.forEach. For each one of these things, I want to append the message. So go back here, run that, and we're still good. And yeah, I think we'll call it there. This is pretty much a totally refactored code base. So we went from a much longer index.js that we can check out here. Assets. So basically, we've gone from this code, like 50 lines of code in index.js, down to 19, and then I guess like 32 more over here. But that, I think overall, it's also going to be a lot more readable. I don't know. We've talked about all of this stuff. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I hope that this has kind of gotten you started. I've put all this on a GitHub repo so that you can see the before and after of the code base. So you probably saw this in assets. I have the JS file, which is just like the standard index.js. And then I have the ES 2015 version of it. So here I named it index and messages.js. So you can go to this GitHub repo and kind of check out this code. I also included those talks, obviously. So if you really want to listen to why JavaScript is terrible, what the JavaScript is there, I really do recommend the WAT talk. It's really funny. And there's a bunch of resources here that is like in no way at all exhaustive, but there's quite a few resources for how to learn ES 2015. Different ES6 features are constantly being just rehashed by people in the community. And so if you Google any of this stuff, there's going to be great resources for learning ES6 and for just understanding how this new syntax in JavaScript is working and some of the problems that it's trying to solve. There's a lot more to learn as well. So again, we haven't really touched on React here, and I know that there were some sessions, and I think there are some sessions, maybe actually even right after this one or like at 5:15, where people are going to be starting to talk about actual like React coding. There's a ton of stuff in the JavaScript toolchain when it comes to like transpiling this code so that it works across all browsers, including like early versions of Internet Explorer. And there's just a ton of new stuff to learn in JavaScript, and I think the language is a lot of fun. As you can see, I'm like in no way an expert on JavaScript. I'm not sitting down and writing this spec. So ES6 is something that hopefully you all find intriguing, and hopefully like next year you'll come and give this talk, because there's still a lot of people who are gonna be really skeptical of JavaScript, but then are gonna go look at some of these code bases and not necessarily know what's going on in them, and are kind of missing out on all of the cool features that are coming in the language, and all of the just like great things that are happening in the JavaScript world. So I guess I'll stick around if you have any questions or if you just want to talk about doing JavaScript development. But yeah, thanks for listening to me for the last 40 minutes. I appreciate it.